The massive space station called Harmony's Edge floated in the darkness between star systems. It was bigger than most moons, with long metal arms reaching out like the legs of a giant spider. Lights twinkled along its surface where millions of beings lived and worked. Today, the station buzzed with more activity than usual. Ships from across the galaxy had come to dock at the station. Some looked like smooth eggs made of crystal. Others were long and thin like metal snakes. A few had so many spikes and angles, they looked like floating weapons. Each ship carried ambassadors from different alien species, and they were all here for one reason. They needed to talk about the humans. Ambassador Zexathara walked through the main council chamber on 6 thin legs. Her purple skin gleamed under the bright lights, and her 4 eyes moved independently as she watched the other ambassadors take their seats. The chamber was enormous, with curved walls that rose up like the inside of a bowl. Floating platforms held representatives from 847 different species. Zexathara had been preparing for this meeting for months. As a member of the Veltari species, she was considered one of the most diplomatic beings in the galaxy. Her people had helped create the Galactic Council 10,000 years ago. They knew how to keep peace between different species who might otherwise fight each other. But the humans were different. They did not follow any of the rules that had kept the galaxy peaceful for so long. "Fellow beings," Zexathara began, her voice carrying through translation devices to every corner of the chamber. "We gather today to address a threat to our ancient order. For 50 years, the species called humans have been disrupting our civilization." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some ambassadors clicked their claws on their desks. Others made whistling sounds that meant agreement in their languages. Zexathara activated a holographic display in the center of the chamber. Images appeared in the air showing human ships and colonies. "Look at what they have done," she said. "They ignore our quarantine protocols. When we tell them a system is off limits, they go there anyway. When we establish trade routes that have worked for thousands of years, they create their own paths." The hologram changed to show a primitive planet where furry creatures lived in simple villages. Worse, they violate the sacred laws of non-interference. Here on the planet Kethmore, they found a species that had barely discovered fire. Instead of leaving them alone to develop naturally, the humans gave them advanced technology. Admiral Korthvan, a large creature covered in gray scales, stood up from his platform. His species, the Drekmari, had always been the military force of the Council. "This is not just rule-breaking," he rumbled. "This is dangerous. When primitive species get advanced technology too quickly, they often destroy themselves." "Exactly," Zexathara agreed. "But that is not the worst part. The humans treat every species as equals. They do not respect the natural order that has kept our galaxy stable. They negotiate with species that should be serving as workers. They share military technology with races that should be under our protection." More murmurs filled the chamber. The Council had always worked on a simple principle. Older, more advanced species guided younger ones. Some species were naturally better at fighting, others at thinking, others at working. Everyone had their place, and the Council made sure they stayed in it. But humans seemed to think every species could do anything. A tall, thin ambassador with skin like tree bark raised one of his many arms. "What exactly do you propose we do about this human problem?" asked Ambassador Thyler of the Entavari. "We have several options," Zexathara replied. "We could place strict quarantine around their space, forbidding them from leaving their home. Systems. We could limit their access to advanced technology. Or," she paused, letting the tension build, "we could remove them from the galaxy entirely." The chamber erupted in discussion. Some species had dealt with humans and found them useful if annoying. Others had never met a human but feared what they represented. A few had been hurt by human interference in their carefully planned societies. Admiral Korthvan called for order. "Before we make any decisions, we should hear all the evidence." For the next hour, different ambassadors stood up to share their experiences with humans. The Zephyrian trade minister complained that humans had started selling goods at prices so low that other merchants could not compete. The Crystalline Collective's representative was angry that humans had helped some of their worker drones gain independence. The Hive Queen's speaker buzzed furiously about humans who had convinced some of her soldiers to think for themselves instead of following orders. But not all the stories were complaints. Ambassador Velka of the Nomad Fleet spoke about how humans had helped her people find new homes when their old worlds became uninhabitable. The representative from the Peaceful Gardeners thanked humans for protecting them from raiders when the Council's forces had been too far away to help. As the testimonies continued, Zexathara felt confident that the majority would vote to take strong action against humanity. The humans were clearly a threat to everything the Council had built. That was when the chamber's main doors exploded inward. Not literally exploded. They simply opened with such force that they slammed against the walls with a loud crash. Security systems immediately activated, but nothing happened. No alarms sounded, no force fields appeared. The station's defensive systems seemed to have simply stopped working. Through the doorway walked a human woman wearing a dark blue uniform. She was shorter than most of the ambassadors, with brown skin and black hair tied back in a simple style. Behind her came 4 other humans, all looking calm and relaxed despite having just broken into the most secure location in the galaxy. The woman smiled as she looked around the chamber. "Hello, everyone," she said in perfect Galactic Standard language. "I'm Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earth Systems ship Defiance. We heard you were talking about us, so we thought we should join the conversation." The chamber fell completely silent. 847 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy stared at 5 humans who had somehow waltzed into their secret meeting. Admiral Korthvan was the first to recover. "How did you get past our security?" he demanded. "Same way we've been getting past your security for years," Sarah replied cheerfully. "Your systems are really old. Ours are really new. It's not even a fair contest." "This is an outrage." Zexathara's voice rose higher than usual. "You have no right to be here. This is a closed session of the Galactic Council." "About us," Sarah pointed out. "Seems like we should have been invited." She walked down the steps toward the center of the chamber, completely ignoring the fact that dozens of heavily armed security guards were pointing weapons at her. Her team spread out behind her, not in a threatening way, but like people who were getting ready to give a presentation. "Besides," Sarah continued, "we brought some interesting information to share. See, we've been monitoring galactic communications for a while now. Did you know your so-called secure channels aren't actually secure? We've been listening to your private conversations for about 30 years. The blood drained from Zexathara's face, turning her purple skin a sickly gray color. "Oh yes," Sarah said, noticing the reaction. "We know all about the slave colonies in the Outer Rim, the ones you tell everyone don't exist. We know about the artificial scarcity programs that keep certain species dependent on Council aid. We know about the technology suppression projects that make sure nobody develops weapons that could threaten Council authority." One of Sarah's team members, a man with red hair and freckles, activated a holographic projector. New images appeared in the chamber. Secret Council facilities, hidden fleets, and most damning of all, recordings of Council members discussing how to keep other species manageable. "For 10,000 years, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "You've maintained peace by making sure nobody could fight back. You've kept entire civilizations at a primitive level so they'd be grateful for your protection. You've told species they were naturally inferior when they were just being held back artificially." More evidence appeared in the air. Financial records showing how the Council manipulated resource distribution. Communication logs where ambassadors laughed about keeping lesser species in their place. Video footage of Council forces destroying research facilities that had developed inconvenient technologies. "The funny thing is," Sarah continued, "we didn't set out to spy on you. We just wanted to trade and explore and make friends. But when we started asking questions about why certain species were forbidden from advancing, why some worlds were off limits, why the same families seemed to control everything across hundreds of star systems, well, we got curious." "You have no proof of these accusations," Admiral Korthvan growled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, we do." Sarah gestured to her team member, who began broadcasting a live signal to every planet in the galaxy. "We're sharing all of this with everyone right now. Every world that receives galactic communications is getting copies of your secret files. The chamber erupted into chaos. Some ambassadors were shouting denials. Others were demanding that the humans be arrested immediately. A few were quietly trying to leave, probably to contact their homeworlds and start damage control, but the humans just stood there calmly, as if they had expected this exact reaction. Now, Sarah said, raising her voice to be heard over the noise. Let's all stay calm. We're not here to destroy the council. We're here to fix it. Fix it? Zexthera practically screamed. You've just exposed classified information to the entire galaxy. Do you have any idea what you've done? Ended 10,000 years of oppression, Sarah suggested. Given billions of beings the truth about their governments, started the process of building a fair society instead of a rigged game. You've started a war, Admiral Korthvon declared. When species learn they've been controlled and manipulated, they'll fight back. There will be chaos across the galaxy. Maybe, Sarah admitted. But that's better than the slow slavery you've been maintaining. At least now people can choose their own future instead of having it chosen for them. Security forces were moving closer, but they seemed unsure what to do. Their weapons were designed to stop normal boarding parties, not deal with a diplomatic situation that was being broadcast live across the galaxy. Sarah noticed their hesitation and smiled. Oh, and don't worry about trying to arrest us. We didn't come alone. She touched a device on her wrist, and the chamber's main display screen changed to show the space around Harmony's edge. Where there had been empty void an hour ago, there were now dozens of ships, not human warships but cargo vessels, passenger transports and colony ships. Between them flew smaller human vessels that looked nothing like any known design. Those cargo ships are full of refugees from your council-controlled worlds, Sarah explained. People who've been living in hiding or working in your secret facilities. The colony ships have entire populations of species you declared extinct decades ago. Turns out, they just moved to places you couldn't find them. And the escort ships? Admiral Korthvon asked, though he seemed to already know he wouldn't like the answer. Those are human vessels using technology your people can't even detect properly. They've been in your space for hours. Your sensors think they're asteroids. The implications hit the assembly like a physical blow. If humans could make their ships invisible to council sensors, if they could break into the most secure station in the galaxy, if they had been monitoring secret communications for decades, what else could they do? This is impossible, Zexthera whispered. Your species has only been in space for a few hundred years. We've been building our civilization for 10 millennia. That's exactly the problem, Sarah replied gently. You've been building the same civilization for 10,000 years. You got comfortable. You stopped innovating because you didn't need to. You had everything locked down. She gestured around the chamber. Look at this place. It's beautiful, and it's ancient, and it hasn't changed in probably 1,000 years. Our newest ships were designed last week. Our computer systems get updated every day. Our scientists are constantly trying new ideas because we don't have a council telling them what they're allowed to discover. But the chaos, another ambassador protested. Without order, without guidance, species will destroy themselves. Some might, Sarah agreed. But most won't. Most species, when given the choice, prefer freedom to safety. They prefer the chance to grow and learn and become something better, even if it's risky. The live broadcast was still running and reports were already coming in from across the galaxy. Some worlds were demanding explanations from their council representatives. Others were declaring independence from council authority. A few were celebrating in the streets. You've destroyed everything, Zexthera said, but her voice sounded hollow. No, Sarah corrected. We've given everyone the chance to build something better. The council can still exist, but it needs to be what it claimed to be, a forum for cooperation between equals, not a control system for keeping people in line. She looked around the chamber one more time. The question now is, are you going to help build that better future, or are you going to fight to preserve a system based on lies? Before anyone could answer, alarms finally began sounding throughout. The station, But they weren't security alarms warning of an intrusion. They were much more serious. Something was coming. Something big. The alarms that echoed through Harmony's Edge were not the sharp warning sounds of a security breach. These were deep, rumbling tones that made the entire station vibrate. They were the alarms that meant something was very wrong with space itself. Captain, Sarah Chen looked up at the ceiling as dust fell from the ancient metal beams. Around her, the Galactic Council members were experiencing their own kind of alarm. The evidence her team had broadcast was already causing chaos across the galaxy, but now something else was demanding their attention. "What is that sound?" demanded Ambassador Zexithara, her 4 eyes wide with fear. Admiral Korthvan was speaking, rapidly into a communication device, his scaled face growing darker with each response he received. "Deep space monitoring stations are detecting massive gravitational disturbances," he announced. "Something large is moving toward our galaxy." "How large?" Sarah asked, though she had a feeling she already knew the answer would be bad. "Larger than our instruments can properly measure," the Admiral replied. "And it's moving faster than light without any detectable engine signatures." Sarah's team exchanged glances. Dr. Martinez, the red-haired man who had been operating their holographic displays, pulled out a small device and began scanning. His face went pale as he read the results. "Captain," he said quietly, "this isn't a ship. The gravitational signature is organic." Before Sarah could respond, every screen in the chamber flickered and changed. Instead of showing the evidence of Council corruption, they now displayed readings from deep space sensors. What they showed made no sense according to any known physics. Something was moving through the void between galaxies. It was enormous, larger than star systems, but it was alive. Tendrils of what looked like flesh stretched across light years of space, and it was heading directly toward them. "This is impossible," whispered one of the council members. "Nothing that large could be alive." "Tell that to the thing that's coming," Sarah muttered. The gravitational disturbances were getting stronger. Ships docked at the station began reporting navigation problems. Some of the smaller vessels were actually being pulled slightly out of their moorings by whatever was approaching. "How long until it arrives?" Sarah asked. Admiral Korthvan consulted his instruments again. "At its current speed. 6 hours. 6 hours. Sarah looked around the chamber at the hundreds of alien representatives who were all staring at the impossible readings on their screens. A few hours ago, they had been the most powerful beings in the galaxy, controlling civilizations that spanned thousands of worlds. Now they looked like frightened children. "We need to evacuate the station," declared one ambassador. "Where would we go?" asked another. "If that thing is targeting us specifically, running won't help." "Why would it be targeting us?" Zexithara demanded. Sarah had a terrible suspicion about that, but before she could voice it, her communication device beeped. She activated it, and the voice of her ship's science officer filled the chamber. "Captain, we're receiving a transmission. It's coming from the entity approaching us." "Put it through," Sarah ordered. The chamber fell silent as a new sound filled the air. It was not quite a voice, more like the groaning of metal under stress or the sound of wind through a vast cave. But somehow, impossibly, everyone understood what it was saying. "Children, you have grown interesting." The words seemed to come from inside their heads rather than through their ears. Several of the smaller ambassadors collapsed, overwhelmed by the psychic pressure of the communication. "Who are you?" Sarah called out, hoping the entity could hear her. "I am what your kind calls an architect. I and my kin seeded this galaxy with life long ago. We have been watching you develop." Zexithara found her voice. "Watching us? For how long?" "Since the beginning. We planted the first cells on your worlds. We guided your evolution in subtle ways. We allowed your civilizations to grow, until now." The implications of those words hit the assembly like a physical blow. Everything they thought they knew about their history, their development, their very existence, was a lie. They were not independent species that had evolved naturally. They were experiments. Why reveal yourself now? Admiral Korthafan asked. Because the experiment has taken an unexpected turn. The entity's attention seemed to focus on Sarah and her team. Even though she could not see it yet, she could feel its vast consciousness examining her, weighing her, trying to understand what she represented. The humans, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Your species was not part of our original design. You developed differently than we intended. You do not follow the patterns we established. Dr. Martinez stepped forward. What patterns? Species develop in predictable ways. They grow to a certain level of advancement, then stagnate. They create hierarchies that maintain order. They accept their place in the cosmic structure. Your Galactic Council was performing exactly as we designed it to. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You created the Council. We influenced its formation. We ensured that the older species would control the younger ones. We made certain that technological advancement would be limited and regulated. We wanted a stable, manageable civilization. Manageable for what? Zexathara asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid of the answer. The entity did not respond immediately. When it finally spoke again, its tone had changed. There was something almost hungry in its vast voice. For the harvest, the word hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as the true meaning became clear. You're not gardeners, she said. You're farmers. We cultivate civilizations until they reach maturity. Then we harvest what we have grown. Your galaxy has been developing for billions of years. It is nearly time. Admiral Korthvan's weapons were useless against something that existed across dimensions, but he reached for them anyway. You mean to destroy us all? Not destroy. Harvest. We take what is useful and leave. The rest to begin again. It is the natural order of things. Natural order, Sarah repeated, and there was steel in her voice. Funny thing about humans, we don't much care about natural orders that someone else imposed on us. Yes, that is why you are problematic. The station shuddered as the entity drew closer. Through the chamber's transparent walls, they could see space itself bending and twisting around something too large to comprehend. You see, Sarah continued, when we found out the Council was controlling and oppressing people, we didn't just complain about it. We did something about it. And now that we know you've been controlling and oppressing entire galaxies, she smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Well, let's just say we have some experience dealing with bullies who think they know what's best for everyone else. You cannot resist us. Your entire species is barely more than children compared to our age and power. Maybe, Sarah agreed. But here's something you might not know about human children. We're really good at getting into trouble. Dr. Martinez was working frantically on his scanner, trying to get readings on the approaching entity. Captain, he said urgently, I'm detecting massive energy buildups. Whatever it's planning to do, it's going to happen soon. How soon? Minutes, not hours. Sarah activated her communication device again. Defiance, this is Captain Chen. Execute. Protocol 7. Protocol 7, Captain, came the response. Are you sure? Do it. Around the station, the human ships that had been escorting the refugee fleet suddenly changed. Their hulls rippled and shifted, revealing weapon systems that had been hidden beneath false panels. But these were not normal weapons. They looked like twisted combinations of human engineering and something else entirely. What are those? Zexathara asked. Something we've been working on for the past few years, Sarah replied. See, when we started exploring the galaxy, we found some interesting ruins on dead worlds. Turns out, you architects aren't the only ancient species that's been playing with galactic development. The entity's attention sharpened. Impossible. We eliminated all opposition long ago. Apparently not all of it. Some of them hid really well. And when we found them, they were very interested in meeting a species that didn't follow your patterns. Sarah's team began activating more devices and new information appeared on the chamber's screens. Images of hidden facilities in deep space. Recordings of conversations with beings that looked nothing like any known species. Technical specifications for technologies that seemed to blend science and something that might have been magic. The predecessors, we call them, Sarah explained. They were here before you. They tried to fight you once and lost, but they survived by hiding in spaces between dimensions. They've been waiting for someone like us. Someone who could think outside the patterns you established. You have allied with our enemies. We've allied with anyone who believes that civilizations should be free to develop on their own terms. That includes the predecessors, the lost fleets that the Council claimed were extinct, and about 40 species that you thought you had wiped out completely. The human ships were moving now, not in attack formation, but in a complex pattern around the station. As they moved, reality itself seemed to shimmer around them. What are they doing? Admiral Korthvan asked. Creating a barrier, Sarah replied. The predecessors taught us how to manipulate dimensional boundaries. We can't stop you completely, but we can slow you down long enough for everyone to see what you really are. Foolish children, you merely delay the inevitable. But there was something different in the entity's voice now. Something that might have been uncertainty. The barrier was forming around the station, a shimmering wall of distorted space-time that made everything beyond it look twisted and strange. The approaching architect slammed into it with incredible force, but instead of breaking through immediately, it was forced to slow down. For the first time in eons, one of the architects had been successfully resisted. Now, Sarah said, let's have a real conversation about the future of this galaxy. The entity's response shook the station to its foundations. You do not understand what you have done. By resisting us, you have initiated the final protocol. We will not simply harvest your civilizations now. We will test them. Test them how? To see if they are worthy of survival. Your species has shown potential beyond our expectations. If you can prove that potential in combat, we will consider alternative arrangements. Sarah felt a chill. And if we fail the test? Then we will ensure that no species ever develops beyond our control again. We will burn this galaxy clean and start over. The barrier around the station was holding, but Sarah could see stress fractures forming in space itself where the architect was pressing against it. They had bought time, but not much. How long do we have? She asked. The test begins now. Reality twisted, and everything changed. The moment the architect spoke those final words, reality around Harmony's edge began to change in ways that hurt to look at. Space twisted like fabric being wrung out, and colors that had no names painted themselves across the void. The protective barrier that the human ships had created flickered and sparked as something vast pressed against it from outside normal dimensions. Captain Sarah Chen gripped the railing of the chamber platform as the station shuddered. Around her, the representatives of 847 species were experiencing their first glimpse of what the architects were truly capable of. Several of the smaller ambassadors had fainted. Others were making sounds of terror in languages that the translation devices could not process. What is it doing? Ambassador Zexathara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Martinez was frantically scanning the distortions with his instruments. It's rewriting local spacetime, he reported. Changing the fundamental laws of physics in this area. Gravity is becoming optional. Time is flowing in different directions in different places. Through the transparent walls of the chamber, they could see human ships struggling to maintain their protective formation. The barrier they had created was still holding, but barely. Cracks of impossible light were spreading across its surface like fractures in glass. Captain, came a voice through Sarah's communication device. This is Commander Torres on the Defiance. We're detecting massive energy buildups throughout the sector. Whatever that thing is planning, it's bigger than just testing us. How much bigger? It's affecting star systems within a 50 light-year radius. Planets are reporting gravitational anomalies. Some are experiencing time dilation effects. Sarah felt her heart sink. The architect wasn't just testing humanity or even the species in this immediate area. It was testing the entire local region of the galaxy. All children of this galaxy, the entity's voice boomed through their minds. Witness the beginning of your final examination. The view outside the station changed dramatically. Where there had been empty space between distant stars, massive structures were now materializing. They looked like geometric shapes made of crystallized shadow, pyramids, and spheres and twisted towers that existed in too many dimensions at once. Testing facilities, Sarah realized. It's creating an obstacle course. Each species will be evaluated according to their potential. Those who demonstrate growth beyond their original programming may survive to see a new cosmic order. Those who fail will be recycled for future experiments. Admiral Korthvan's scales had turned pale gray. How are we supposed to pass tests designed by beings who created us in the first place? They know our capabilities better than we do. No, Sarah said, her mind racing. They know what our capabilities were supposed to be, but humans weren't part of their original design, and we've been helping other species develop in ways they didn't plan for. She activated her communication system again. This is Captain Chen to all human vessels and allied ships. The test is beginning. Remember what we learned from the predecessors. The architect's power comes from their understanding of the patterns they created. If we can act outside those patterns, we might have a chance, Dr. Martinez finished. The first test began immediately. The space around several of the Council member species' home systems twisted, and their worlds found themselves facing challenges that defied their understanding of the universe. On the crystal-covered world of the Veltari, gravity suddenly reversed, pulling everything toward the sky instead of the ground. For a species that had built their entire civilization around living in vast underground tunnel systems, this should have been catastrophic. But the Veltari had been working with human engineers for the past decade. When their world turned upside down, they activated gravitational anchors that humans had helped them develop. Instead of falling into space, their cities remained stable while they figured out how to adapt to their new circumstances. On the ocean world of the Aquatic Federation, all water suddenly became acidic enough to dissolve their natural armor. This should have meant extinction within hours for a species that lived entirely underwater. Instead, they deployed environmental suits that had been designed through collaboration with human scientists. The suits not only protected them, but allowed them to continue functioning while they worked on neutralizing the acid, using techniques they had learned from human chemistry. The architect is trying to force them back into dependency, Sarah observed as reports came in from around the galaxy. Every test is designed to make species need council protection again. But it wasn't working the way the entity expected. Years of human influence had changed how other species approached problems. Instead of waiting for authority figures to save them, they were improvising solutions. Instead of accepting that their situation was hopeless, they were adapting and fighting back. On the war world of the Drakmari, the architect created creatures made of living flame that should have been impossible to defeat with conventional weapons. But the Drakmari had learned human military tactics that emphasized creativity over brute force. They used ice weapons combined with directed sound waves to disrupt the creature's energy patterns. On the agricultural world of the peaceful gardeners, the soil itself became hostile, trying to consume any plant that grew in it. But the gardeners had been sharing growing techniques with human colonists. They used hydroponic systems and artificial soil that the entity had not accounted for. It's working, Dr. Martinez said excitedly, as he monitored the galactic communications. Species after species is finding ways to survive tests that should have been impossible. But Sarah noticed something troubling in the data. The tests are getting harder, she said. The architect is adapting to our adaptations. She was right. As the entity realized that its initial challenges were being overcome, it began escalating. The living flames on the Drakmari world became immune to ice and sound. The acidic water on the Aquatic Federation's planet started eating through their protective suits. The reversed gravity on the Veltari homeworld began fluctuating wildly, making their anchor systems useless. It's learning from our responses, Admiral Korthvan observed grimly. How do you fight an enemy that can redesign reality to counter whatever you do? Sarah was about to answer when alarms began sounding on her communication device. Not the general alarms they had been hearing, but the specific emergency signal that meant one of humanity's deepest secrets had been discovered. "Captain," came an urgent voice from one of her team members on another ship. "The architect has found the hidden sanctuary. Sarah's blood went cold. The Hidden Sanctuary was humanity's most classified project, a space station built in a pocket, to mention where they had been working with the predecessors and other ancient species to develop weapons and defenses specifically designed to fight the architects. If the entity had found it, all interesting, the architect's voice boomed through their minds. The small ones have been preparing for this confrontation for longer than we realized. The view outside the station changed again. In the distance, partially visible through dimensional fractures, they could see the Hidden Sanctuary. It was a massive structure that looked like a combination of human engineering and alien technologies that seemed to grow rather than being built. Around it, ships were engaging in combat with creatures that defied description. Beings made of crystallized time fought against vessels that phased in and out of existence. Weapons that fired concentrated gravity battled against defenses made of solidified music. The predecessors, Sarah said. They're fighting back. And they will lose as they did before, the architect replied. But their involvement makes this test more significant. The entity's attention turned fully toward the Hidden Sanctuary, and Sarah realized with horror what was about to happen. The architect was going to destroy the facility and everyone in it, eliminating humanity's secret allies and their advanced weapons in one strike. But that would also mean abandoning the tests it had set for the other species. Wait, Sarah called out. If you destroy the sanctuary, you won't get to see how your test plays out. Don't you want to know if your experiments have truly failed or if they can still be saved? The architect paused, and Sarah could feel its vast consciousness considering her words. You created this entire galaxy as an experiment, she continued. Billions of years of careful cultivation. Are you really going to throw all that away just to eliminate a few rebels? The experiment has been contaminated. The variables have been altered beyond acceptable parameters. But that makes it more interesting, doesn't it? Any fool can predict the behavior of a system they designed. But when that system starts producing unexpected results, that's when you learn something new. Sarah was gambling with the lives of everyone in the galaxy, but she could sense that the architect was genuinely conflicted. It was an ancient being that had probably seen the same patterns repeat countless times across countless galaxies. The fact that something genuinely new was happening seemed to be intriguing to it. You said we were interesting earlier. If you wipe us out now, you'll never know just how interesting we could become. The assault on the Hidden Sanctuary slowed, then stopped. The architect's attention returned to the tests happening throughout the galaxy. Very well, the experiment will continue, but the parameters will be adjusted. The tests that were already challenging became nightmarish. Gravity didn't just reverse. It became a living thing that actively hunted people. The acidic water didn't just dissolve armor. It gained intelligence and began coordinating attacks. The hostile soil didn't just consume plants. It started growing its own predatory vegetation. But something else was happening too. As the challenges became more extreme, the species facing them began working together in ways they never had before. The Veltari shared their gravitational anchor technology with other species facing similar problems. The aquatic federations, chemical solutions were transmitted to worlds dealing with hostile environments. The Drakmari's combat innovations were adapted by peaceful species who had never needed to fight before. It's not just testing individual species, Dr. Martinez realized. It's testing whether the galaxy can function as a unified civilization. And we're showing it that cooperation is stronger than control, Sarah added. But even as some species were succeeding, others were failing. Entire star systems went dark as civilizations that could not adapt quickly enough were overwhelmed by challenges they had no framework for understanding. The architect was keeping score, and Sarah suspected that the passing grade for this test was going to be very, very high. Captain, came another voice through her communication device. We're receiving a transmission from the predecessor command ship. They say they have something that might help, but what? They need a human to activate it. Something about our neural patterns being uniquely suited to interfacing with their technology. Sarah looked around the chamber at the hundreds, of alien representatives who were watching their entire civilization hang in the balance. Then she looked at her team, who were all staring at her with expressions that said they knew what she was thinking. "Tell them I'm on my way," she said. "Sarah," Dr. Martinez protested, "we don't know what that technology does. It could kill you." "If we don't try it, we're all dead anyway," she replied. "Besides, I'm getting tired of letting ancient cosmic bullies decide what's best for everyone else." As her team prepared to transport her to the predecessor ship, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. She had started this day planning to disrupt a Galactic Council meeting. Now she was about to attempt something that might reshape the fundamental structure of the universe. Just another day in the life of a human, she supposed. The transport from Harmony's Edge to the predecessor command ship took only minutes, but during that short journey, Sarah Chen watched her entire understanding of the universe change. The predecessor vessel existed partially outside normal space-time, which meant the trip required passing through dimensions where the normal rules of physics did not apply. She saw colors that had no names, heard sounds that were actually mathematical equations, and felt emotions that belonged to beings who had died millions of years ago. By the time she materialized on the ship's bridge, she understood why the predecessors had been able to hide from the architects for so long. The bridge itself was a marvel that hurt to look at directly. Surfaces curved in directions that did not exist in three-dimensional space. Control panels seemed to be made of crystallized thought, and the crew members who operated them were barely recognizable as once having been biological entities. The predecessor who approached her might have been humanoid once, but eons of existing between dimensions had changed them into something that was more concept than creature. When they spoke, their words appeared directly in Sarah's mind as symbols that somehow conveyed meaning, without language. "Human Sarah Chen, Captain Explorer Defiant," the being communicated. "You arrive at the moment of greatest necessity. The architect entity Harvester Ancient grows more desperate as your species and allies continue to exceed its predictions." "Desperate how?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It escalates beyond mere testing. It prepares to implement Final Protocol Universe Reset. If activated, all matter and energy in this galaxy will be dissolved and reconstituted according to original design parameters." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "You mean it's going to restart the entire galaxy from scratch?" "Correct. All current life will cease. New life will be seeded according to more restrictive patterns that cannot develop beyond architect control limits." Through the ship's viewing systems, which showed reality from several different dimensional perspectives simultaneously, Sarah could see the tests continuing across the galaxy. More species were failing as the challenges became increasingly impossible. Entire civilizations were being snuffed out like candle flames. But she could also see something the architect might not have noticed. The species that were surviving were doing so by abandoning their traditional approaches and adopting human-influenced methods. They were cooperating across traditional boundaries, sharing resources and knowledge, treating each other as equals, regardless of their supposed place in the cosmic hierarchy. The test isn't really about individual survival, Sarah realized. It's about whether we can evolve beyond the predator-prey relationship the architects designed us for. Correct. Architect entities exist in constant state of consumption-dominance hierarchy. They cannot conceive of sustainable civilizations based on cooperation, growth, mutual benefit. Your species represents an evolutionary path they did not anticipate. And they're terrified of it, Sarah said. Terror response inappropriate term for entities of such scale. More accurate, they experience fundamental paradigm threat. If cooperation proves superior to dominance, their entire existence becomes obsolete. That gave Sarah an idea. What if we could show them that cooperation isn't a threat to them? What if we could prove that working together creates more interesting results than the old predator-prey system? The predecessor's form shifted in what might have been the equivalent of shaking their head. Impossible. Architect entities are locked into dominance patterns by their very nature. They cannot change without ceasing to be what they are. But what if some of them wanted to change? You said there are many architects across the universe. Are they all identical in their thinking? There was a pause as the predecessor consulted with others of their kind through methods Sarah could not perceive. When they responded, There was something like surprise in their mental voice. Interesting query. Long-range dimensional scanning indicates variations among architect entities in distant galaxies. Some appear to have evolved beyond original design parameters. However, local architect remains locked in traditional patterns. Then we need to show it that evolution is possible, even for architects. How do you propose to accomplish such a task? Sarah looked at the crystallized thought control panels around her. You said you had something that might help, something that requires human neural patterns to activate. Correct. We possess Reality Modification Engine. Device was created during original war against architects. It allows conscious beings to directly influence fundamental forces through focused intent projection. In simple terms, it makes thoughts real. With sufficient mental discipline and clarity of purpose, operator can reshape matter, energy, space, and time according to their will. Sarah felt a chill. That sounds incredibly dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Previous operators have been dissolved, scattered across multiple dimensions, or transformed into forms of existence incompatible with continued consciousness. However, human neural architecture shows unique compatibility with device requirements. Why are humans different? Your species evolved to hold contradictory concepts simultaneously without mental breakdown. You can believe in both individual achievement and group cooperation. You can accept both order stability and change growth. This paradox tolerance allows interface with reality engine without cognitive dissonance-induced dissolution. Sarah thought about that. Humans did have a talent for believing multiple conflicting things at once. They could love their families while exploring the stars. They could respect ancient wisdom while constantly innovating. They could cooperate with other species while maintaining their own cultural identity. What exactly would I need to do? Connect your consciousness to reality engine. Use focused thought to demonstrate to architect entity that evolution beyond original parameters is not only possible, but desirable. Show it visions of what could be rather than what has always been. And if it doesn't work, local reality collapse is probable outcome. Galaxy dissolution will follow. All consciousness in region will be terminated and restarted according to architect-preferred patterns. Sarah considered her options. The tests were continuing throughout the galaxy, and more species were failing every minute. The architect's patience was clearly running out. And once it decided the experiment was irredeemably contaminated, it would implement its reset protocol. But there was another consideration. The thousands of refugees aboard the human ships around Harmony's Edge. The species that had been declared extinct but were actually living in hiding. The civilizations that had managed to break free from council control, only to face potential extinction at the hands of their cosmic creators. How long do I have to make my decision? Architect entity shows signs of final protocol preparation. Dimensional reality anchors are being established throughout galaxy. Process will be complete in approximately 3 of your hour units. 3 hours. Sarah activated her communication device to contact her team back on Harmony's Edge. Dr. Martinez, what's the status of the galactic tests? Not good, Captain. We've lost contact with 47 star systems. The challenges are becoming mathematically impossible to overcome. Even the species that were succeeding earlier are starting to fail. How many are still passing? Maybe 30%, and that number is dropping fast. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about everything that had led to this moment. Humanity's first contact with galactic civilization. The discovery of the Council's corruption. The revelation that their entire existence was part of an ancient experiment. The knowledge that beings beyond their comprehension were prepared to erase everything they had ever known or loved. And now she had the chance to change it all. To show the architect that evolution was possible, that the old patterns of dominance and control could give way to something better, but only if she was willing to risk her own existence in the process. I'll do it, she said. The predecessor's form shifted again. Decision requires absolute certainty. Once connection is established with reality engine, disconnection may not be possible. Your consciousness may be permanently altered or destroyed. I understand, but if I don't try, everyone dies anyway. Correct. Follow path indicators to engine chamber. Sarah walked through corridors that existed in more dimensions than her mind could properly process. The walls seemed to be made of crystallized time, and her footsteps echoed through periods that hadn't happened yet. Several times she passed other predecessors who paused their activities to observe her, the human who was about to attempt something that had killed every other being who had tried it. The engine chamber was a spherical room with no clear floor or ceiling. In the center floated a device that looked like a sculpture made of pure mathematics. Geometric shapes that couldn't exist in normal space rotated around each other in patterns that suggested the fundamental equations underlying reality itself. Human Sarah Chen, the predecessor guide communicated, place hands on interface nodes and focus thoughts on desired reality state. Engine will amplify mental patterns and project them into universal substrate. Warning: Entity Architect will sense modification attempts and respond with extreme hostility. Sarah approached the device. Up close, she could see that the mathematical shapes were actually composed of smaller equations, which were themselves made of even tinier symbols that seemed to represent concepts rather than numbers. She placed her hands on what her guide had called interface nodes. They felt warm and seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The moment she made contact, her consciousness exploded outward. Suddenly, she could perceive the entire galaxy simultaneously. She could see every star system where the architect's tests were taking place. She could feel the fear and desperation of billions of beings facing challenges designed to destroy them. She could sense the architect itself, a vast intelligence spread across multiple dimensions, coldly calculating the failure rate of its experiments. But she could also see something else. In distant galaxies, other architects were conducting their own experiments, and some of them were asking different questions, pursuing different goals, evolving beyond the simple predator-prey relationships that had defined their species for eons. Sarah focused her thoughts on those distant architects. She tried to project images of what she had seen, species working together, sharing knowledge, helping each other grow and develop. She showed the local architect visions of civilizations that had moved beyond the need for dominance hierarchies. The response was immediate and violent. "Impossible!" The architect's voice thundered through both her mind and the physical universe. "Cooperation is inefficient. Hierarchy is natural order. Dominance ensures survival." But Sarah could sense uncertainty beneath the anger. The architect had never been exposed to evidence that contradicted its core beliefs. For the first time in its existence, it was encountering information that challenged its fundamental understanding of how consciousness should develop. Sarah pushed harder, drawing on every example of successful cooperation she had witnessed. The human ships protecting refugee fleets, different species sharing technology to overcome impossible challenges, the alliance between humans and predecessors, despite their vastly different natures. "These examples are aberrations," the architect insisted. "Temporary anomalies that will collapse into natural patterns." But even as it spoke, Sarah could feel its attention turning to examine the evidence more carefully. For a being that had existed for millions of years, the concept of being wrong about something fundamental was almost incomprehensible. Through the reality engine, Sarah began reshaping local spacetime to demonstrate her point. Instead of showing the architect visions of cooperation, she would make it experience cooperation directly. She connected the entity's consciousness to every being in the galaxy that was currently working with others to survive the tests. For the first time in its existence, the architect felt what it was like to trust someone else, to receive help, without giving up autonomy, to achieve goals that would have been impossible alone. The result was the psychic equivalent of an explosion. What is this sensation?" "It's called friendship," Sarah said through the connection. "And it's just the beginning." The moment the architect experienced true cooperation for the first time, reality around the galaxy began to change in ways that no one had expected. Through the reality engine, Sarah could feel the entity's consciousness reeling as it tried to process sensations that had no equivalent in its previous existence. Friendship, trust, mutual benefit without dominance. These concepts were so alien to the architect that experiencing them directly caused massive disruptions in its thought patterns. The tests it had been conducting across hundreds of star systems began to falter as its attention turned inward, trying to understand what was happening to it. But the disruption worked both ways. As the architect's rigid control over local reality wavered, the impossible challenges it had created began to break down. Gravity stopped being a hunting predator and returned to being a natural force. Acidic oceans became merely acidic instead of intelligently malicious. Hostile soil lost its appetite for consuming everything that touched it. Sarah, Dr. Martinez's voice came through her communication device, though it sounded distant and strange while she was connected to the reality engine. The tests are destabilizing. Species that were failing are suddenly finding solutions to challenges that were impossible just minutes ago. She could sense it herself through her expanded consciousness. Across the galaxy, civilizations were discovering that the nightmarish scenarios they had been facing were now manageable problems with achievable solutions. More importantly, they were continuing to work together even though the immediate threat had lessened. The cooperation that had developed under extreme pressure was proving to be more than just a survival mechanism. It was becoming the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization. But the architect was fighting back against the new sensations flooding its consciousness. "No," it thundered, its voice creating ripples in space-time itself. "This is wrong. This is unnatural. Consciousness develops through competition and dominance. Cooperation is weakness." Sarah could feel the entity struggling to reject the experiences she was forcing it to share. But the evidence was overwhelming. Every connection it made with cooperating beings showed the same pattern. Groups working together achieved results that no individual could accomplish alone, and they did so while maintaining their individual identities and strengths. "It's not weakness," Sarah said, through the reality engine connection. "It's multiplication. When beings work together, they don't lose their individual power. They combine it with others to create something greater. Impossible. Power shared is power diminished. Only if you think of power as a limited resource that has to be hoarded. But knowledge isn't diminished when you share it. Trust isn't weakened when you give it to others. Love doesn't decrease when you extend it to more beings." To demonstrate her point, Sarah used the reality engine to show the architect something that had never existed before in any galaxy it controlled. A network of civilizations sharing resources, knowledge, and support without any central authority, commanding them to do so. Through her connection to the engine, she reshaped the space around several star systems to create communication networks that allowed instant collaboration across vast distances. She modified the laws of physics in small areas to enable technologies that worked better when operated by multiple species together than by any one species alone. Most dramatically, she created shared spaces where beings from different worlds could meet and interact in environments that accommodated all their different biological needs simultaneously. The results were immediate and stunning. Instead of the careful, hierarchical interactions that the Council had maintained for thousands of years, these new meeting spaces erupted with chaotic creativity. Species that had never been allowed to communicate directly began exchanging ideas, forming partnerships and creating innovations that none of them could have imagined alone. Within hours, technological advances that would normally have taken decades were happening in multiple star systems. Art forms that combined the aesthetic sensibilities of dozens of different species were emerging. New philosophies were developing that incorporated wisdom traditions from across the galaxy. "Stop," the architect commanded, but its voice lacked the absolute authority it had possessed before. "This level of rapid change is dangerous. Civilizations require stability to prevent collapse." "Some civilizations do," Sarah agreed, "but others thrive on change and growth. The key is letting each society choose its own path instead of forcing them all to follow the same pattern." She could sense the architect's confusion deepening. For millions of years, it had operated on the assumption that there was one correct way for consciousness to develop. The idea that different approaches might be equally valid was challenging its core programming in ways that were almost painful to observe. But she could also sense something else: curiosity. Hidden beneath layers of ancient certainty, and cosmic arrogance. The architect was beginning to wonder what else it might have been wrong about. What other possibilities might exist that it had never considered? Sarah seized on that curiosity and used the reality engine to show the architect something even more revolutionary. Visions of other architects in distant galaxies who had begun to evolve beyond their original programming. "You're not the only one of your kind," she said. "And you're not the only one who's starting to question the old ways." Through the dimensional viewing capabilities of the predecessor ship, Sarah projected images of architects who had begun experimenting with cooperation instead of dominance. Some had learned to work with their created civilizations instead of controlling them. Others had discovered that they could grow and change just as much as the beings they had seeded with life. A few had even begun forming alliances with other architects, sharing knowledge and experiences across the vast emptiness between galaxies. "Show me more," the architect demanded, and Sarah could hear genuine hunger in its voice. For the next several hours, she guided the entity through vision after vision of what was possible when beings chose cooperation over competition, growth over stagnation, curiosity over control. She showed it civilizations that had flourished for millions of years without any central authority. She showed it technologies that worked by bringing out the best in different species rather than by forcing them into predetermined roles. Most importantly, she showed it architects who had discovered that evolving beyond their original nature was not a betrayal of what they were, but a fulfillment of what they could become. The change in the entity was gradual, but unmistakable. The rigid patterns of thought that had defined it for eons began to soften and shift. The absolute certainties that had driven its actions for millions of years started to give way to questions and possibilities. I had not considered," the architect said, and its voice was different now. Smaller, more personal, less like the pronouncement of a cosmic force and more like the words of an individual being. "That's the thing about cooperation," Sarah said gently. "It's not just about working together. It's about being open to ideas you never would have thought of on your own." Through the reality engine, she could sense the entity examining its memories of the tests it had been conducting. But instead of seeing them as evaluations of species' fitness for survival, it was beginning to see them as opportunities for learning and growth. The species that had failed the tests weren't inferior beings that deserved extinction. They were civilizations that had been forced to develop under artificial constraints and needed different kinds of support to reach their potential. The species that had succeeded weren't just proving their worthiness to survive. They were demonstrating new ways of approaching problems that even an architect could learn from. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. The entity's attention turned to the galaxy around them, but its perspective was completely different than it had been hours earlier. Instead of seeing a collection of resources to be managed or harvested, it saw a community of beings with their own goals, dreams, and potential for growth. "Now," the architect said, "I learn what it means to be part of something larger than myself." The changes that followed were visible from one end of the galaxy to the other. The impossible testing structures that the architect had created throughout space began to transform. Instead of becoming obstacles designed to eliminate the weak, they became learning environments where different species could explore new possibilities together. The gravitational anomalies that had been threatening to tear planets apart became power sources that could be shared between star systems. The time distortions that had been causing chaos became opportunities for civilizations to experiment with different approaches to development. Most significantly, the architect began to undo the artificial limitations it had placed on technological and social advancement. Species that had been kept at primitive levels for thousands of years suddenly found themselves able to access knowledge and capabilities they had never been allowed to develop. But the entity was careful not to simply hand them advanced technology without preparation. Instead, it created collaborative learning networks where more experienced civilizations could help guide the development of newer ones, while also learning new perspectives from their fresh approaches to old problems. Sarah watched these changes through the reality engine with a mixture of exhaustion and amazement. What she had accomplished was beyond anything she had imagined when she first stepped into that council chamber. She had not just prevented the destruction of galactic civilization, She had helped transform it into something entirely new, but there was one more thing she needed to do. "I have a request," she said to the architect. "Speak. There are other galaxies out there where your kind still operates under the old system. Civilizations that are still being controlled and harvested. I want your help to contact those architects and show them what we've learned here." The entity considered this for a long moment. Such communication would be unprecedented. My kind does not typically collaborate across galactic boundaries. Then maybe it's time to start something new. Sarah could sense the architect reaching out, across the vast emptiness between galaxies, making contact with others of its kind for the first time in eons. The conversations that followed were beyond her ability to fully comprehend, but she could sense their tone shifting from suspicion and hostility to curiosity and interest. Not all of the distant architects were ready to abandon their old ways, but some were intrigued by the reports of successful cooperation and evolutionary growth. A few began their own experiments with allowing their subject civilizations more freedom to develop. It would take time, possibly millions of years, for the changes to spread throughout the universe. But the process had begun. Sarah finally disconnected from the reality engine, her consciousness snapping back to her individual human perspective with an almost physical shock. The predecessor who had guided her to the device was waiting nearby, their form somehow managing to convey both respect and amazement. "Unprecedented achievement," they communicated. "Entity Architect Local has undergone fundamental pattern reformation. Probability of universal cooperation cascade has increased from negligible to significant." "What happens to me now?" Sarah asked, suddenly aware of how exhausted she felt. "Return to human ships and human life," the predecessor replied. "Your species has proven concept viability. Architect Entity will no longer interfere with natural development processes. Galaxy is free to evolve according to conscious choice, rather than imposed design." The transport back to Harmony's Edge felt much shorter than the journey to the predecessor ship, but Sarah suspected that had more to do with her mental state than with any changes in the space between them. She materialized on the station's main bridge to find her team and hundreds of alien representatives watching her, with expressions that ranged from awe to terror. "Captain," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "what exactly happened out there? Reality itself seems to have shifted." Sarah looked around the chamber at the faces of beings from across the galaxy. Species that had been enemies for thousands of years were now talking quietly together about shared challenges. Representatives who had never been allowed to speak in council sessions were being treated as equals by races that had previously considered them inferior. The ancient hierarchy that had defined galactic civilization for 10 millennia was dissolving, but instead of chaos, what was emerging looked like the beginning of something much better. "We grew up," Sarah said simply. Admiral Korthvan, who had been one of the strongest supporters of the old system, stepped forward. "Captain Chen," he said formally, "on behalf of what remains of the Galactic Council, I would like to offer humanity a position as, well, as equal partners in whatever comes next." Sarah smiled. "We'd be honored, but not as leaders or guides, as friends and colleagues." Ambassador Zexathara, her purple skin now displaying patterns that indicated deep thought, rather than fear, approached as well. "There will be much work to do," she said. "Systems to redesign, relationships to rebuild, new ways of cooperation to develop." "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but for the first time, we'll be doing that work together, as equals, building something that serves everyone instead of just maintaining the power of a few." She walked to the chamber's observation windows and looked out at the space around Harmony's Edge. The human ships were still there, but they had been joined by vessels from dozens of other species. Instead of the careful hierarchical formations that had defined council meetings for thousands of years, the ships were arranged in a loose, organic pattern that somehow managed to accommodate the different needs and preferences of all the species present. It was, Sarah thought, a pretty good metaphor for what they were all trying to build. A new kind of civilization. One based on cooperation instead of dominance, growth instead of control, curiosity instead of fear. It wouldn't be perfect, There would be conflicts and misunderstandings and failures along the way. But for the first time in the history of the galaxy, those problems would be addressed by beings working together as equals rather than being imposed from above by cosmic entities who thought they knew better. Sarah smiled as she watched a human cargo ship dock alongside a crystalline collective transport vessel, their crews already working together to unload supplies for species that had been struggling with the aftermath of the architect's tests. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said to Dr. Martinez, who had joined her at the window. "What's that, Captain?" "We never wanted to crash their council or fight cosmic entities or reshape the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. We just wanted to explore and make friends and maybe do a little trading." And now, Sarah watched as representatives from species that had been declared extinct decades ago walked openly through the station corridors, sharing stories and ideas with beings they had never been allowed to meet before. Now, we're all free to become whatever we choose to be. And that, I think, is worth all the trouble we went through to get here. In the depths of space, the entity that had once been simply the architect continued its own journey of discovery, learning what it meant to be part of a community instead of ruling over one. Its vast consciousness was already reaching out to other galaxies, sharing the story of what had happened and inviting others of its kind to consider new possibilities. The universe, it seemed, was finally ready to grow up. And it all started with a human captain who had refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be.